Hello and welcome to Unplugged, an IoT podcast where we dive deep into the fascinating world of industrial Internet of Things and automation. I'm your host, Phil Seboa, and today we have a very special guest and a friend of the show, Vladimir Romanov, an industrial leader in digital transformation and education. Vlad has founded Joltech and Solus PLC, a thought leader in industrial automation and a passionate advocate for upskilling the manufacturing sector. Him and his co-host have been, hundreds now of episodes on Manufacturing Hub podcast with Dave Griffith, and who previously has been on this show. So it's great to have you on too, Vlad. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Today, we want to take a second just to talk about our sponsor, Inductive Automation. You know, we've been involved with Inductive Automation for a long time now. And I just wanted to ask you, what are the benefits of using Ignition?
G'day, Phil. Oh, you're right. You and I have been involved with Inductive Automation. Actually, we got to know each other through Ignition. One of my favorite things here, Phil, and I think you agree, is that the unlimited nature of how Ignition runs. It's got unlimited clients, unlimited tags, come from unlimited PLCs or unlimited devices, unlimited databases. And on top of that, you can have as many designers open connected to it as well. So that unlimited nature for me, it just ticks the boxes.
Yeah, we're just kind of taking away all those traditional boundaries from software, the software SCADA landscape. So if you're looking for a modern approach to your application development, Ignition is the one. And especially, using the free download that's available on their website, you can start building today.
Yeah, and go and check it out in the show notes, inductiveautomation.com.
Well, I think firstly, I want to dive into a bit of your journey into automation. Maybe you can give us, for people that haven't seen you or heard about you, what's your history into getting into this field?
Sure, I'll do my best to keep it short. Ultimately joined, the first company that I joined was Procter & Gamble, which was fundamental to a lot of my technical knowledge. I was a process controls and information systems resource. I learned everything from programming PLCs to commissioning entire production lines. I had a bunch of VATs and FATs to bring equipment from overseas back to the US. I then moved on to Kraft Heinz back in 2016 in a maintenance manager type of a position, supervised mechanics and technicians, making sure that the plant is running. So sort of got to experience both the good, but also the challenging side of maintenance. I then moved on due to some closures and mergers between Kraft and Heinz, I moved on to work for a small systems integrator. So completely different environment, going from very large multinationals to now starting to consult and sort of do smaller type of project work, but nonetheless, traveling to different factories across the US in the food and beverage space. At that point in time in my life, I was doing, 95 to 98% of travel. And after 3 years, it starts to get a bit challenging. Let's put it that way. So I decided to pair the challenge, but also with my desire. I had gotten my GMAT done earlier in my career in order to pursue sort of a business degree. So I decided to go back to school and do a full-time MBA back in 2019. After the MBA, my initial vision or my desire was to go back into manufacturing consulting, but I actually went a different route, a little bit non-traditional career-wise. And I went into a startup with 4 other gentlemen in the DevOps and IT space. So different than manufacturing, but also allowed me to learn quite a bit on the IT infrastructure side. And, we can expand on that a little bit later, but ultimately learn anything that has to do with software, cloud, Kubernetes, et cetera, et cetera. As of last year, I amicably parted ways with the startup. Still have a couple of shares based on the vesting period from VCs, and that's a whole other story, but ultimately decided to come back to manufacturing. As you've mentioned, I've been doing quite a few things while still working on the startup idea that kind of pulled me back all the time. I really love to see products being made. I still travel to sites. I have a on-site visit lined up next week, but ultimately that's my background. I integrate systems from PLCs and HMI all the way to the data and MES layers.
It's really amazing, I guess, your journey between, being an end user and then going out and seeing the world. Because we find that some of the end users, if they've grown up in that plant infrastructure, they don't really have the wider view, right? They're
Yep.
very expertised in their own processes, but then when they go out and see the world for the first time, I guess maybe you can give your view on what that experience was like. Like, what did you see from coming out of the world of your own kind of manufacturing space?
Sure. So, I mean, I can share this because, it's been quite a few years, but the P&G side I was working at was extremely advanced when it comes to automation, right? And when I say advanced, we ran at 85% OE, like actual OE, because P&G, again, has implemented very rigid rules, and not just on the technical side, right? It's also how people do root cause analysis, how people do daily direction settings, how people understand data and the value provided by data. But ultimately, when I left that specific site that was fairly advanced, I've realized how far, other companies are to some extent from being there. And that's not necessarily to say that every site of P&G operates that way. There's definitely differences from site to site, but it certainly opened my eyes to what else is out there. And to be honest with you, I always, while in that position and just trying to learn the ropes of, automation engineering, ultimately thought that everyone was at that same level. And it is definitely not the case, from what I've seen since then.
Even at that high level, right? If you're in an advanced manufacturing and you go out and see, oh, okay, so where can I then add the value to these other manufacturing lines? What were we doing really well at that particular site? I think, that movement of people through the industry is sometimes a really positive thing. Everyone looks at, it being as a negative layoff type scenario, but you can take all the good that was happening at those businesses and then move them around the industry as well. So those lessons learned don't go to waste, basically.
Absolutely.
As well. So that's a really interesting conversation we can have for sure. I guess going from the traditional PLC landscape and moving towards that digital DevOps position, I guess, what did you learn there? What were the driving kind of changes there and from that space that you could maybe share with us?
Yeah, so let me split it into two, right? There's obviously a lot of business learnings on how to operate a startup and furthermore a venture-backed or a VC-backed startup versus, the technical side of software development. So on the technical side, I think it's night and day, right? It is definitely, best practices of clean code and sort of maintainable code and code with comments are almost taken for granted in the software space. And if you don't do things in a way that I want to say, again, are accepted, then you're almost never going to be able to create something that will be adopted by the end user, right? So for us, again, building a tool on the DevOps side meant that everything needed to be robust, everything needed to be production ready, everything needed to be, when you say it's going to be built on the cloud, it doesn't just mean it's an EC2 container, right? It means that it needs to have a proper load balancer. It needs to be properly scaling. It needs to be able to absorb a certain amount of traffic. So long story short is I learned that the software space, fortunately or unfortunately, I guess depending on how you see it, is I think years ahead of some of the best practices you will see on the production floor today. Now on the business side, of course, again, I think the challenges were different. I think that when you have conversations with experts in that space and when you're trying to raise money, the conversations are very different because software is changing at a much much faster than what you see in OT. So going back to the questions on, upskilling or developing a product in the manufacturing space, you build a product that can last, a decade. In software, it's very rapid sprints because things 2 months from now are obsolete because of, a specific library or specific function. So the conversations are very different. Even on the business side, when you're raising money, it's very fast. It needs to be, quick proof of concept that you're moving into something that makes sense and solves a business case. Whereas in manufacturing, of course, it's a completely different conversation on that side.
Yeah, so I guess it's a really good point in terms of, preparing yourself, especially in the OT space, right, for, landscape shifts. You want to make sure that your plant floor is future proof, as hard, as hard as that is. Using open standard technologies and those types of things help, because you don't see so much shift in the technology space, especially from a software layer. And, software vendors are really trying to look out for their customers by making things backward compatible and not doing major releases that break, the chain as well. So it's just kind of, you have to really do your research when you're going in at that hardware level, that it's going to be compatible with your future landscape and your current landscape as well. So I guess that leads us into, I guess, overcoming some challenges around those legacy systems. I guess, what are the biggest challenges around that? Where can you see it? I guess, what strategies have you found most effective for bridging that gap between legacy and the new? Maybe you could share some thoughts around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, my current work with manufacturers involves a lot of legacy systems, right? The reality is that before you can extract the data, before you can synthesize the data, and before you can draw, conclusions to better the performance of your lines or the entire facility, you need to spend a lot of time contextualizing the data, but ultimately upgrading the equipment to be even able to communicate the data out, right? So to your point, in the software space, my conversations would be, hey guys, you're using this library from like 6 months ago. What are you doing? You need to upgrade, right? This is already no longer supported. In manufacturing, I traveled to a site a couple of weeks ago. They're still using Windows 98 machines to run some of their sort of like HMI and SCADA/MES infrastructure. So the reality, I guess, or a challenge that obviously happens then is you need to do, first of all, an assessment. You need to understand where we are. You need to understand usually where you're going to go, but ultimately you also need to piecemeal that, because you cannot invest $10 million in one shot and just rip and replace the entire architecture. So the challenge is really, or the first challenge is being able to upgrade to something that makes sense. I will say that the second challenge, right, which relates a little bit more to the IIoT or data topic, is data context, right? So even if you upgrade the, let's call it the PLCs and the HMIs and the IPCs to something that's able to pull out the data, a lot of legwork, and I think people sometimes underappreciate that when they come from maybe the vendor perspective, but a lot of legwork needs to be spent in, Vlad is sitting there understanding each machine by machine, line by line of code, because whether you want it or not, you and I get sent to program the same machine in two different locations of the world with two different customers. They're going to be completely different. They will operate the same way, but the machine itself is going to have different code. So a lot of times, when I go to a site, even after an upgrade, it requires that engineering, I want to say brute force working hours to just sit there, understand the process, understand the data, contextualize the data in order to just pass that data into either, a broker or a database, which then can be analyzed. So that is a very huge challenge for manufacturers. And to be honest with you, there's tools to do it better. So there's certain, interpreters now of PLC code. There's libraries where you can, for example, on the Rockwell side, you can extract technically a text-based file and you can parse the file. And now there's AI or co-pilots that make it easier. But I still think it's shrinking that time versus, eliminating that sort of like brute force approach. But again, that's what a lot of my work entails, is just understanding the data, understanding the process, understanding whether it's batching, whether that's discrete manufacturing. So I think for me, that's the biggest kind of heavy lifting challenge for IIoT, at least with my clients.
Yeah, understanding that level of detail in the code is going to accelerate any further iterations of it, right? So if you can have well documented code, at least you've got the comments there to go, okay, this is the intent, right? This is why we did these things. It shortens that conversation, that development path by hours in some instance, because I don't know how many times I've kind of looked at code and gone, and what were they trying to achieve by doing this endless loop as well? So yeah, it's really been kind of an interesting path when you start diving into those legacy systems and walking the plant floors, systems that have been really working for a number of decades sometimes as well. So you go in. So I, from my experience so far, is you go in and you talk to the teams there, and they've been really doing excellent work to get the products or assets really pumping out the door and providing that infrastructure, but they're wanting to take it to the next level. They want to try and to upgrade and do those things. I guess, what are the challenges around the people side IoT?
Look, I have always been very outspoken on the fact that I think the people challenge is even greater than the technical challenge. The reality is there's no shortage, I think, of technologies and tools and opportunities to make things better. And again, that's a lot of it is coming from the IT side, but also the vendors in industrial automation have become quite good at the tools they've been providing. Now, the human aspect is what is very, very tough. So I would say, number one, almost every factory I go to is hiring for control systems engineers, right? So there's a clear lack of, just people, and, to take a step back from IoT or Industry 4.0, just people who can maintain the plant running, but ultimately slowly improve the plant as well, right? Run some of those projects where they can remove obsolescence, maybe upgrade controllers, HMIs, data sources, whatever that is. The second challenge is, of course, everyone always has the question of ROI, right? When it comes to data-specific projects, I think it's very difficult to estimate ROI before you have actually done anything. And so you very often get in this kind of limbo, almost, if I want to say, like, position where the vendor cannot guarantee you an ROI because ultimately it's dependent on how your facility uses that data. But the company doesn't want to pay for the project or for the initiative before they see a guaranteed ROI, right? So there's always this clash. The next question, of course, is who's going to pay for the specific project. So a lot of times, when it's an upgrade, you can very easily articulate that, hey, you're running Windows 98 machines. You probably should not be running Windows 98 machines at this point because your team's buying them on eBay. So therefore, the OT or the operations is going to pay for this project. But when you start talking about data, again, it's both OT and IT because, again, servers are going to live on the IT side. And so now you need to articulate a bit better because OT no longer wants to pay for that until they see the ROI. And IT is not fully understanding why that architecture is going to be the way it is. So long story short, to your question, I think the challenge is getting alignment and getting a clear sort of understanding of where things will go and how those things will bring an ROI and who will ultimately execute the project on the people side. And I think that's the hardest part, at least for me, it has been over the last couple of years.
It's definitely going to be a challenge as we move forwards, right? It's just the level of digital maturity as well on the plant floor to understand what technology is available. There's an education portion there because most of the time you just don't know what you don't know, right? At the end of the day. So just trying to get people's digital maturity up from where they were before in those legacy systems. They're understanding their PLC code, they're understanding those, but those enhancements, they're looking for partners and leaders in that space to help them along the way as well. I guess in your in your experience on the plant floor, maybe you can share some real world scenarios where you came in and you maybe identified one of those challenges. Does anything come to mind from your perspective?
Well, look, like I said, I think a lot of my work, and again, the specifics are you start with an assessment, right? So again, I can tell you I've been to many factories. The assessment usually reveals that there's a lot of obsolete equipment. My world has been on Rockwell Automation, right? Just because of the nature of where I'm based. So what does that look like? The assessment is opening every panel, looking at the PLCs, the HMIs, usually some of the servo drives, the VFDs, identifying. You can go on the Rockwell website, you can plug in the part number, it will tell you which parts are obsolete. You then go through the process, or I'm going through the process multiple times of intelligently figuring out what actually should be replaced and what can be left alone, right? Because like I've told you, the budget to replace everything doesn't make sense. And it also doesn't make sense to just rip out everything at once. So you need to prioritize certain areas. So for me, the question is, I need to have a conversation with the plant manager, engineering manager, ops manager, understand what area do we tackle first, right? So to your question, that's the first step in, in my projects. The next step, of course, is we do the upgrades. There's a lot of remote work which is involved, followed by, an on-site FAT or VAT, making sure that everything functions as it used to. At that point, all we've really done is upgraded, from a PLC 2 or a PLC 5 to a control logics, compact logics, or whatever is the equivalent. We've also we're going to consolidate some of those pieces of equipment. If you had a PLC per machine, well, with the modern equipment, and it's not necessarily just Rockwell, it can be done on Siemens, Opto, whatever, you can use one PLC now instead of 5 very old ones, right? And so that to me is kind of a day-to-day type of work that I would do. The next step is then extracting that data into an application, right? So like I've mentioned, this is also weeks worth of work, because whether you want it or not, I understand different processes. I've not done every single process, so I need to speak with the plant personnel. What does this process do? Understand the batching process. That also means I'm pulling tags out of those PLCs, right? And that could be via writing code on the PLC side, but also writing code in an application. There's drivers for every PLC that you can write on the server to pull them into a database, historian, or broker. So that's that's the real world kind of start to a project. At that point, you're presenting the data either via custom dashboard, or if it's Ignition or Factory Talk USC, right? So the platform of your choice for the MES, and ultimately you're going to be, to some extent, and this is hit or miss, to be honest with you, depending on the plant you go to, who will drive the changes and sort of the change management from those insights. And to be honest with you, I'm a little bit less involved on that side. For me, it's always been a very technical challenge. But usually the plants try to leverage data to varying degrees of success, right? I'll be honest with you there. But they do get the data that they need in order to improve the performance of the facility.
It's kind of the upgrade is the first piece in the puzzle usually, right? And then you identify, okay, so we were at this benchmark and now we're at this benchmark. How can we leverage that improvement or upgrade path? Not just from, okay, now we're supported by the vendor, but what functionality has grown from, your standard PLC code? Maybe you're now using pure function blocks and pure code blocks rather than just straight up ladder logic, right? So you can start leveraging some of those technology differentiations. You might have a Ethernet network card now rather than a specific protocol, or you might be able to leverage an MQTT type functionality, or it's just about identifying those small wins even within that same upgrade path as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now we've got a more advanced PLC. What can we do with that type of process?
Well. Yeah, 100%, right? As you mentioned, there's a lot of protocol elimination as well. again, for better or for worse, a couple of decades ago, those protocols were released for a very specific purpose, right? And now Ethernet has become the standard for communication, and therefore you no longer need, deterministic protocols like ControlNet or even Circos, for example, right? So, and again, that's on the Allen Bradley side, but you have similar types of protocols that you'll find in other platforms. So yes, to your point, it's not just about, just replace the PLC to a newer model. It's also reducing kind of failure points on some of the older equipment, but also finding ways that we can leverage easier, I want to say, the data, the information, but also the automation tools of the newer platform. So if you've ever opened up a very old PLC, and I have tons of examples, maybe throw in a Siemens example on the side. I remember there was a case packer running on a TI 505. It's a very old, robust PLC, like really good hardware, but ultimately you open the manual and it's like, well, the software comes on 32 floppy disks, so that's how you're going to start, like programming this thing. And so like no one's available that has that type of equipment anymore. So it's also, modernizing on that side. Now you can connect with a normal machine, which can also be then said, and again, this is kind of plant stories, the guys are no longer bringing this machine with a parallel port and connecting onto that PLC. They now are connecting through the right protocol over, a secure network. So you have some cybersecurity kind of concerns with the legacy systems, and you can now access budgets maybe that are not just purely operational, but also from the IT standpoint, because you're now also improving, software, you're improving hardware, and ultimately addressing some cybersecurity issues as well.
Yeah, traditional kind of systems have always been kind of air gapped, right, from the outside world. So just even upgrading and creating these security models gives you access to more talent. Right, we've spoken about the reduction in the labor force, right? Not necessarily, all your engineers have to be based on site. You can use third-party vendors. You can use community members to be able to leverage that pool of talent outside of your organization, but then give them access securely and monitored type approaches, so that you don't have to necessarily put on someone full-time at the facility. You still may have an electrician there, you may still have your mechanical guys, but the code base that they have can be accessible via the internet through a secure channel that is managed by IT as well. So having those, they still will have those challenges about understanding the code, right? But at least they don't have the factor of that they have to travel to site, and that could be hundreds of thousands of kilometers or miles away as well. I guess as you go through your journey, and you've traveled the world, visiting lots of different conferences, lots of different technology days, and I guess what have you learned, or what are you learning now that you didn't expect maybe that you were going to learn 6 months ago?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So I am a big advocate in continuous education or ongoing learning, right? So I'm always paying attention to what everyone, to be honest with you, is saying, how things are done in other facilities. I think we can certainly learn a lot from each other. What am I learning specifically? Well, I've always been on the lower layers, so to speak, of the automation stack. And although I have, a good understanding of IT architectures, I don't have I feel a very strong foundation in some of the MES tools specifically, right? And that has to do with brokers, with historians, and even with some MES platforms. Again, happy to get into the specifics. So I'm currently, learning as much as I can on that side. And obviously there's free resources available more and more, I find, but I still think there's a lack of very solid content in our space on the education side, right? But again, and we'll chat about this a little bit, right? But there's many different solutions for each, I want to say, specific solution, whether that's, again, historian, MES, SCADA, CMMS, right? There's a lot of different tools. So I'm just trying to I want to say, learn at a surface level all of them, but at a deeper level, I'm currently, picking out my specific stack because, again, to be honest with you, with age, you also cannot be spread too thin, in my opinion. So you need to, at some point, pick and choose. And again, happy to kind of like answer the question as to why I'm making some of those decisions. But yes, I'm learning certain components of the specific stack when it comes to the UNS.
So I guess why the motivation to learn about those MES type applications then? What are you seeing in the industry to drive you in that direction?
So look, I guess over the last maybe 5 years, I've certainly done many data projects, and I've always felt that at least, during COVID or pre-COVID, I want to say people didn't fully understand the necessity for data, right? And when a lot of people were, I guess, sitting at home or needed to access remotely a specific site or were asking questions of, why was production down? I think that now more and more people are bought into the premise that data can solve a lot of manufacturing problems, right? And so the reason why I continue to learn on this side is because I think that to some extent, PLC programming and HMI and SCADA development isn't necessarily going to be commoditized, but it has been, like, I guess I've learned everything that I need to learn to some extent on that side. And I'm not an expert in every platform, but I understand PLC programming, I would say, fairly well, and HMI programming fairly well. So I'm just looking to expand more into the data side. And I think there's unique challenges there that are not present on the OT side.
Yeah, as the I guess the OT landscape is really becoming that, oil well of data. It's really kind of, we're collecting a huge amount of inputs and outputs, analogs, runtime events, huge amounts of data being flooded into that space. We need a way of corralling it. Data is not of value until it turns into information, right? And the thing is with the introduction of AI and ML and all these types of innovations, they're just ways of accessing that information, getting more insights into that data, rather than specifically just having the data there. It doesn't really add any value to your operation until you turn it into that meaningful context around the decision that you're trying to make on the plant floor as well. I guess how have you seen that data being extracted? How do you see maybe supervisors, or how do they get the best bang for their buck out of this huge data collection space?
So look, to be honest with you, my perspective on that side is I still think that despite companies understanding the value of data, I still see a lack of plant floor understanding of data, right? And what I mean by that is, again, I think a lot of people deploy exceptional tools that can pull data, but I think that there's a lack of knowledge, data, I want to say like insights or assessment, right? Because whether you want it or not everyone has taken a class on probability and statistics, right? So if you create dashboards that give you high level insight, so for example, OEE, you can certainly have, fundamental conversations as to why we're running worse this week than we did last week. But then you need to look a little bit deeper, right? And a little bit deeper could mean looking at fault codes. And usually, when I show up to facilities, they can tell me what their OEE is, and they can tell me maybe how many pallets of a specific product they've made on a specific line. But I still find that people are not good at prioritizing their actions to remedy those situations, right? And again, what I mean by that is the tools are there, but I don't feel like the human aspect is good enough to leverage those tools to their full potential, right? And I know it's not a very positive view. I think, again, going back to your question on education, I think that a lot of times we as integrators maybe get really excited about a tool or a solution, but we don't close the loop with that human aspect and that change management aspect, right? I've seen, even if, we'll talk about ProveIt, I guess, in a little bit, there's a lot of demos of AI and chatbots, right? And many vendors, including the hardware vendors, are releasing chatbots to analyze code and pull out insights. Well, for me, the question is, who's going to train the operator on using that chatbot? What is the operator going to actually do, right? In some companies, they will be fixing issues. In other companies, nothing but a loader of materials, right? So there's a lot of nuances I think are still unaddressed when it comes to closing the loop of the specific data. And look, on the positive side, the people who get it, right? I've talked to a couple of groups that get it. They truly get it, right? They're like, we need the tools. We're lacking like this specific insight. We need the information. And once they get it, you don't really need to teach them. They have that kind of understanding of what they can do. But I will tell you, most of at least the companies I'm dealing with are still struggling on that like change management side, that analytical side. And it is hard, right? Like, to be honest with you, once you implement the flow of data and you have synthesized information and data, it's like, as we've discussed a little bit earlier, that's not the whole piece of the puzzle. You need to actually leverage it through supervisors, operators, etc.
Yeah,
Does that
if
make
you
sense?
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you don't educate the team once you start deploying that, even prior to deploying any solution, you don't bring them on the journey, you'll get a really low adoption rate. You know, they'll see it as a corporate push for, you know, some particular reason. You know, and they won't see the benefits, and they won't have a buy-in on that, you know, that engagement, especially from an integration point of view. You have to kind of build that trust level up. You have to take those learnings from the operators or from the supervisors that are going to be using the tool and really tailor it to their specific requirements. And actually just hearing out people's views on the plant floor is really powerful in that sense. And it gives them some stake in that process. So you'll see higher adoption rates if you're actually talking to the people that are going to use it, you know, building out you know, a user interface that actually means with context around their operation. You know, you can have a spreadsheet that is running really efficiently, but if someone comes in from some other area of the plant and can't use it, it's really you don't get the value out of it.
Absolutely.
As well. So that education portion, you know, that change management process, we're seeing more companies having those change management managers or project managers to really keep educating the people that are on the plant floor, and we're seeing more success in that space when people are at the table as well. I guess
I would definitely agree.
Yeah, as we said, people and process, the technology is there, but people and process, that's the bit where we need to work on the most, really.
Yes.
As well. So you've had a very busy few weeks as well, and you went over to the ProveIt conference. It's been great to see some of the feedback there in terms of everyone getting really excited. I'd like to hear what was your takeaways from the ProveIt conference.
Yeah, so I guess for me, the first kind of comment is I really like the concept, right? Because ultimately, as a technical individual, I like people to show me instead of explaining to me, right? And I think a lot of, I want to say, people in our industry have gotten to the point where, you know, I go look at a slide deck, or I go look at a, you know, film presentation, somebody explaining to me what a system does instead of showing me the actual system. So I think from that standpoint, the concept is great. I think it was extremely well received by the community. I think it revealed a lot of appetite for learning, because many, again, like this brings back to our conversation to the end users. I think that many end users want to learn, but many of them also had fairly fundamental questions, right? A lot of people did not understand, like, let alone UNS, but they didn't even understand how to get data into a database. They didn't fully understand what some of these vendors are solving. And I think it just demonstrated as well, I guess, the interest, but also a lack of maybe knowledge when it comes to the entire stack. And I think, you and I have been in the space for many years, but as you mentioned, an end user who comes with a background where, their plant, and I had many conversations at the conference where, I was told, hey, our plant runs on a single PLC and we're struggling to add valves to this PLC. And, the operators are manually loading bags of ingredients into this kettle. So we're trying to implement a checkweigher system. Like, they're nowhere near understanding what a data historian is. They're just, trying to stay afloat with their operations. So I think that's the first takeaway from the conference. There's definitely an appetite to learn more. The other one, maybe from the solution provider or maybe the vendor side, I think as Walker mentioned as well, I think there were really good vendors, and it was almost, if you know the vendors, you almost anticipate that they're going to do well or they're going to do not so well. And I think there was a clear image for me, or I guess a clear disconnect for certain vendors that, because in our industry, again, this is a difference between software and sort of industrial automation. A lot of the vendors in our space go through integrators as the people who implement the solution. So my point here is that you also saw a clear lack of understanding of end user problems from certain vendors that I think were too isolated from the plant floor, right? And I think they'll definitely improve in the next year, but it is a highlight of an interesting, I guess, dilemma in our space. In software, if you want to purchase a certain application or if you want to subscribe to a service, usually you can go direct versus, for us, it's integrators and distributors. And whether you agree that's better, wrong, worse, you know what I mean? That's irrelevant. That's just the situation of our industry. It was very interesting to see that dynamic, so to speak, and how different vendors approached the challenge and how they succeeded and or failed at the challenge.
I tend to agree. I really love the concept of actually the ProveIt function of the course, right? It really kind of challenged those vendors in a way that they haven't really been challenged before, because, from a vendor side, I can talk from both sides of the fence now. From a vendor side, you're selling the solution, right? You've already predefined, the objectives of the platform that you've already tried to achieve. So really, traditional sort of conferences have always been, a bit of a marketplace, a bit of a selling of the wares, functions and features type approach. Whereas the ProveIt conference is, how do you apply those functions and features to a real world scenario, contribute to the bigger ecosystem, which is kind of really interesting in that space, and it kind of really puts the vendors in an interesting position, because they have to then like walk the walk and talk the talk, right? As well. But they don't necessarily have the context, right? So they don't have all the experience of, the checkweigher, the operator, leaving his station unlocked, right? Just to say, maybe it's in a public area, I don't know. But, those types of scenarios that come out of actually being in the real world as well. And, all these types of things. So it's really interesting that probably the vendors got a lot more feedback from the user side to say, okay, so now we're seeing you implement these types of solutions. You're feeling our pain. And feeling that.
100%. Look, and I've gotten, questions, or I guess comments on some of the LinkedIn posts I made about ProveIt. And it was a gentleman asking, did the vendors, or I guess the participants at the ProveIt conference, receive a clear set of directions on what needed to be built and what needed to be solved? And I responded to him a little bit in private, and I told him, hey, like, how many times have you as a systems integrator went to a company and they're like, here's, the 5 steps we want you to implement? In my experience, that has been zero. It's always been, and I think like that's why there needs to be a higher emphasis on that initial step, which is understanding the data, because no end user, again, from what I've seen, is going to tell you, hey, we've analyzed everything. We've done all the, the passes of this data. Here's 1, 2, 3 that you need to do for us. It's really going to be for the integrator or the solutions provider, you know what I mean? Quite frankly, they don't really care to do that step themselves because they look at you as the expert. And so to me, the point of ProveIt was not just the final result, it's actually how you got to the final result based on the data set that was not ideal that was provided to you, right? So I think it needs to continue to embody that sentiment, which is in the real world, data is not perfect, and no one's going to tell you what problems they've already found and they need you to eliminate. That's just simply, I've not seen it happen, right? So I'm not going to say never happens, but it has not happened to me.
And that's the kind of link around the challenge of ROI, right? Is that you don't actually understand fully the challenges that you'll face. You just don't know what you don't know up front. So, you know, it's really hard to say, okay, I can do it at this budget, but I don't, you have to have this huge element of risk involved. And that usually is, you know, added cost in those budget kind of estimates as well. So that's something that you have to kind of factor in as part of that project. But usually it's really a challenging point to kind of
100%, right? And to your point, Phil, you know, if I look at that data, and again, I've not done so in detail, but if I'm putting myself in the shoes of a vendor, I'm looking at that data, I should be able to identify, let's say, 5 specific challenges. I should be able to speak to their magnitude, and then I have a solution that may not solve the biggest challenge for that specific factory. Maybe it's challenge number 2, challenge number 3, which is fine, right? You should also not try to fit your hardware or software to a solution that doesn't make sense, right? So you should identify the challenges, pick the one that's right for your tool, and then again, like demonstrate to your point, what's the ROI of solving that challenge with your tool and at what cost, right? So to me, that's what the challenge entailed. And again, I think it showed that maybe some vendors are better than others at pinpointing, I guess, the specific challenge. And I also, you know, I'll put a caveat as well. I think that some of the best performing tools at the conference, and I think they'll be releasing, you know, the top ones to the public. I don't know exactly when, I didn't get an ETA, but it's also the fact that, you know, some of them were positioned better to solve the biggest challenge for that specific data set, right? If you're a hardware provider, I think it's a lot more difficult, you know, even for me to say like this controller is going to solve your data challenge, because then I'm not even using I'm using the controller like an IPC at that point, really. So, you know what I mean? It's hard for certain vendors to fit that biggest challenge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, especially when you're having a quite high, you know, these challenges that they've kind of laid out is at an enterprise view, right? Rather than not necessarily the challenges that are on that data collection portion as well.
Exactly.
But the great thing about ProveIt is that you can, you know, the vendors were able to, you know, talk with the end users, get their real-time feedback, understand how they fit in the ecosystem, because usually it's, you know, vendor versus vendor, whereas this was, you know, how can you contribute to the overall picture as well. So it was really interesting. Was there any particular standouts for you, know, not just on the, I guess, the challenge side, but just on a technology side that you'd never seen before, or you thought was interesting, or you know, what stood out for you?
To be honest with you, hard question, right? So Dave and I did quite a few engagements and we spent a lot of time talking with people. So I've only attended 4 actual sessions. So I think Dave maybe attended 6. But long story short, you know, I'm looking forward to them releasing the recordings of the sessions to give, I want to say, like a final take. But ultimately, again, like the guys at Flow, I think made very good announcements. They've released Timebase a couple of weeks prior to the show, which I think made a lot of sense. HiveMQ, of course, did also a very big release. I watched Tulip as well as Litmus. Right, and so Tulip, of course, it's not a platform I'm very well familiar with. So to me, it was very interesting how they pulled in data, not only on their side, but also from different vendors. Again, they're more on the discrete manufacturing side. I've always been more on the process and batch. So it was very interesting to see how things are done in different environments. But like I said, to give maybe my final answer, I'd have to watch all the sessions. There's been some interesting takes as well. I don't know if you've seen the Amy Williams, who was one of the MC videos. So I'm very curious to see all the sessions, before I give maybe my final take on what was really good, really bad, or otherwise.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, it was. I think it was a really great conference from what I'm hearing, and a really experienced. So they're hopefully announcing that they're going to be having one next year as well. Maybe I can get over there and see the guys, and really kind of interested in getting over there and seeing what it's all about. And then I guess as we close out the podcast today, what's your, I guess, next steps on where are you going? What's new for Manufacturing Hub? What Solus PLC is ramping up, or what's new? What's going to happen?
Well, look, again, as you made the introduction, I've got my hands in a couple of things. So ultimately, I guess as of early 2025, my time is split between, so Solus PLC continues to expand slowly but surely. It is going to be a couple of days a week on my side. We have a solid foundation on the technical content. We have a couple of guys or course creators that will continue to publish. Mostly, again, we had this conversation a bit off stream, but ultimately a lot of our customer base wants more Rockwell as well as Siemens training. We're exploring other platforms as well, more on the SCADA and MES layers, but it's still TBD. My role there, again, is talking to the customers, make sure that they're getting what they ultimately paid for and are expecting to get on the training side. When it comes to Manufacturing Hub, so Dave and I will continue to do the weekly conversations. The month of March is going to be on ERP systems, which I think is very interesting, right? So I've certainly had to deal with tying in plant floor data into ERPs, but I think there's a lot to be discussed on what the modern stack and ultimately what the modern ERP system looks like, what kind of value it provides. I've worked in, as I mentioned, in very large manufacturers where SAP was the standard. So I'm curious to learn what other alternatives there are for, medium to small size manufacturers. And then, we have a couple of trade shows planned. So we will be going to Automate in Detroit. If I'm not mistaken, that's going to be in the May timeframe, early May-ish. I will be going to OT SCADACon. So I don't know if you know the automation ladies. They're organizing a conference called OT SCADACon. I will be presenting there. I think it's a obviously smaller venue, but ultimately I'm a big fan, of a smaller, tight-knit community. I think that makes a lot of sense from a conference standpoint, but also from a networking standpoint. And that, if I'm not mistaken, is maybe mid to end July out of Texas. And last but not least, I guess currently penciled in is ICC, which is going to be in, they moved the location, right? So now instead of being in Folsom, it's in Sacramento, right?
Correct, yes.
So, absolutely. And that's going to be, I just don't want to make the mistake, is it September?
Yeah, I believe it's September.
Yes, September 16th through the 18th, 2025. So that's currently, on the plans for Manufacturing Hub. And I guess to end that note, for myself, I'm always looking for conversations with end users and systems integrators to find more work on, PLC, HMI, SCADA, and MES systems, as well as data integration. So I'm currently, learning more platforms, as I've mentioned, on the stack, making sure that I'm, knowledgeable enough to speak to them, but also to integrate and make sure to provide good solutions for the end users. So happy to have that conversation.
Well, on that note, we have had a incredible conversation, and I've been on the Manufacturing Hub podcast as well, and it's been a while now, so I might have to make a return at some stage.
Absolutely, yes, we'll have to bring it back.
But yeah, so if any of our listeners would like to contact Vlad, I'm sure he will want us to contact him on LinkedIn. Is that your main kind of channel for
directions? Yeah, I'd say, I spend probably more time than I should on LinkedIn. So if you want to reach me, it's the easiest place. I spend a little bit of time in other communities obviously the 4.0 Discord. I'm also hanging out a little bit on the PLC subreddit. I don't know if sometimes there's good questions, sometimes it's kind of hit and miss, but ultimately, if you want to reach out to me directly, it's going to be on LinkedIn. And of course, you can find my content. You've mentioned, Solus PLC, Joltech, and a few other websites.
Awesome. And thanks very much for coming on the show. And to all our listeners, don't forget to subscribe to Unplugged and IoT podcast. Follow us on LinkedIn. Give us a like. 5-star reviews on Spotify. That's always handy. So yeah, thanks very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you, everyone.